the 30 for 30 on the Heisman race of 1997 came out, here's how I feel about the Heisman, and tell me I'm wrong. I believe it's still an incredible award. I believe it is one of the best awards that you can win. I do believe there are politics involved. I think it does go to the quarterback a lot, but the quarterback has more impact on a game than anybody else by far. It's unlike any other sport. And I think the Heisman still means a lot. But when I say the H word around Tennessee fans, they're like, no, it means nothing. So I'm curious with our guys on the message board. I'm curious for you, Caleb. Does the 1997 Heisman race, in which I'm not even going to debate this, Charles Woodson should not have won it. Peyton Manning should have won it. It was manufactured by ESPN. I know from people at ESPN at the time to make it a race between a Big Ten player. Ron Dane was a part of it at the time. And Woodson stuck more than even ESPN wanted it to. And that's why he won the Heisman. People kind of went off and ran on that. Charles Woodson is a phenomenal player. That's not in the discussion. But do you still begrudge the Heisman voters, of which I am one? Do you still begrudge them for that year and that award? Is it tainted, the Heisman Trophy, still? Because they're doing a 30 for 30 on it now, and I don't think it should be. And I think that to say Nico has no chance of winning a Heisman, which people have said because they hate Tennessee, and this goes all the way back to Johnny Majors, is silly. I think it's still an incredible award, and it would be disappointing if in my lifetime, for all the work that Tennessee's put in it, and the fact that Majors and Manning, I thought, both got gypped out of a Heisman. I believe that it would be a shame if there wasn't a Heisman Trophy in Tennessee's trophy case at some point. You?
I think so too. I think that, look, 1997 was and I want to say this, you're right. This has nothing to do with Charles Woodson, but it taints the fact that that was the greatest Heisman race of all time. Because you had Peyton Manning, Charles Woodson, Randy Moss. By the way, hot take, I don't care what anybody says. You give me Randy Moss's first 7 years in Arizona, I will take them over any receiver in the history of college, in the history of the NFL, Dave. I would take him over Jerry Rice tomorrow, his first 7 years in Arizona, or in Minnesota, excuse me. And I take him over your boy Michael Irvin and Megatron, best receiver of all time for those 7 years. So you had Randy Moss, Peyton Manning, Charles Woodson, all Hall of Famers. And I think Chad Pennington was fourth, wasn't he? And then Ryan Leaf, even a Hall of Fame.
Because of Randy Moss. Because of Randy Moss basically got an and one.
That is, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Hey, do you want to bring your quarterback? Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Yeah. And then,
Chad Pennington's a friend of mine, by the way. So no, anybody.
And then also the greatest bust of all time in Ryan Leaf. Although I think Jamarcus Russell's a bigger bust because Fred has enlightened me. And I've heard more stories that Ryan Leaf was dealing with a lot of issues and in the worst organization you could possibly deal with for his personality and his issues. I think the thing that was so upsetting to a lot of Tennessee fans, and they rightly feel upset about it, is that the standard changed that 1 year for the Heisman that they had never applied beforehand. Okay. They said literally, and Eddie George had the nerve. You may have been in the room, Dave, because I was covering Tennessee at the time. Do you remember when Eddie George spoke to the media, during a Tennessee week during 2006 or whatever? He was in Tennessee and he kind of spoke to everybody during Fulmer's media session. It was like a Tuesday media session with Fulmer. And
I would have been so focused. That probably would have got kicked to somebody else, and I would have written about.
Well, Eddie George was asked about the Heisman vote because he had one because he won it, and he admitted he voted for Woodson, and he said at the time he had the nerve to say this publicly that Peyton Manning didn't beat Florida, so I couldn't vote for him to win the Heisman. Now Eddie George won the Heisman when he lost to Michigan. Danny Warfel won the Heisman right after he lost to Florida State. Now, yes, Danny Warfel came back and beat Florida State, but the Heisman vote was before that. Okay. So how are you going to hold that against Peyton Manning, but you didn't hold it against Eddie George? You didn't hold it against Danny Warfel. They for this 1 year, they said it's not the best player. It's the best player on the best team. That's the only year they had that standard because the next year they gave it to Ricky Williams and Texas was 9-3, I think, that year. So, and 40 years before they gave it to Paul Hornung when Notre Dame was 2-8. And that's the one you're talking about with Johnny Majors. Now, I don't think Johnny Majors was one who got screwed out of it. It was Jim Brown who got screwed out of it. Jim Brown should have won the Heisman. I know Majors finished second, but if you look at the numbers, Jim Brown was the best player in college football that year. And
well, but with all that history, I mean, should Tennessee fans resent the trophy? Yes, but how would they react if Nico were to win it?
Oh, I think they would be thrilled if Nico were to win it. But it would be really funny if it would be hilarious just to what if this happened, Dave? What if Nico won it but pulled an Eminem at the Grammys like years ago and just didn't show up?
Oh no, don't say that.
I mean, that would be great.
Or
but
like I would Kanye goes up there to Taylor Swift and says somebody else should have won it. What is it, Kanye that did that?
Beyonce had one of the best videos of all
Beyonce.
time.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's
so Kanye did it for Beyonce because Taylor Swift won. Do I have that right?
Right, exactly. Kanye did it on behalf of Beyonce because Taylor Swift won. And but yeah, that would be hilarious. But I just want to say that yes, there was an anti-SEC bias back during that time at ESPN because let's call it what it is, Dave. ESPN didn't have a deal with the SEC. And how much you know this, you worked at ESPN until 2008. They did have it out for the SEC because the SEC had that deal with CBS, and every other conference had a deal with ESPN, and the network hated the SEC for it. And for people who rant about this SEC bias stuff, there is one team since the start of the BCS era to the playoff era that has finished the regular season undefeated, the whole season undefeated from a BCS or Power 5 conference and not gotten a shot at the national title. That team just happens to be from the SEC, and it was Auburn in 2004. And they should have gotten a chance to play USC that year.
Yeah, and the other 30 for 30 that's floating around out there is about Reggie White. And I think there is a correlation between the two in that it's a little bit disappointing to me how they're remembered. And I think Peyton, for some, is remembered as the guy that couldn't beat Florida. And in the Heisman talk, which he had no control over, he didn't win. And then with Reggie White, he kind of fell out of favor with some Tennessee fans towards the end of his life, and rest in peace. And I don't know why exactly that is. I thought he did a lot to support. At the time, there were African-American churches that were being burned, and I thought Reggie White stepped up to that. And I think when you do that, you probably can say some things that turn people off when you didn't intend to. But I always respected the fact that Reggie White was willing to speak his mind. I respected the fact that he was an open-minded individual that wanted to know so much about religion that he studied Judaism for like hours at a time, I was told. And he would just sit there and read for hours at a time. But the 30 for 30 on him as well. He's one of the greats. And, it is interesting to me. I was talking to my son about Reggie White, and you could argue the two greatest linemen of all time came from Chattanooga, Tennessee. John Hanna, who played at Alabama, and Reggie White, who played at Tennessee. Both are from the Chattanooga area. There's a little bit of knowledge I bet you weren't aware of.
That's very intriguing. You could also argue the two best defensive lines in NFL history played at Tennessee because Reggie White and Doug Atkins both played at Tennessee.
I see what you're saying. I thought you said the best defensive line. They didn't play together. I got you. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to be honest, and there was
Doug Atkins, by the way. I'm sorry to interrupt. Doug Atkins, by the way, like I see some pictures, and you guys look a little bit younger. He was Victor Wembanyama. I mean that Doug Atkins was that guy. He was. You
need to give up on Victor Wembanyama. Do you see how bad the Spurs are this year? You need to give up on him.
He's going to be really good. He's going to be really good.
But anyway, he can get their team to the playoffs in the NBA.
Okay, well, I could say a Mike Vick. There are other transcendental. Randy Moss to me was a transcendental type of receiver. He was that guy who was. They didn't they outlaw jumping over offensive linemen because of him. He was like 250 pounds, which at the time was huge, and he's jumping over people. But back to Reggie White. One of the true all-time greats. And I haven't seen the 30 for 30 on him yet. I was talking to somebody about Reggie White just recently in the Chattanooga area who said that Tennessee wasn't even crazy about him, that they actually liked his teammate better than him. And that's how Reggie got on the radar. There were so many steps along the way, and Reggie didn't have a great junior year at Tennessee, but had a great senior year. There were so many steps along the way that perhaps could have sidelined his career. He was one of the first free agents as well when he went to the Green Bay Packers. That could have been a disaster. The Packers were terrible growing up. I think people remember them now as winning a couple of Super Bowls, but the Packers are like the uncle that really wasn't worth anything. You love them because they're the Packers and they're owned by their fans, but they didn't do anything on the field.
No, they didn't. This 30 for 30, it touched on Reggie White's, delve into religion. I'm mixed on it because Reggie White never really had a chance to show how his views being changed, even though they were changing as he was getting older in life. Like, this is what's so unfortunate when someone dies at 43, isn't it, Dave? A lot of times they may not have a chance to show that they may have changed, because I'm going to be honest. Reggie White's homophobic comments that I saw from him really, really rubbed me the wrong way. And the things he said that were just extremely homophobic.
I was actually not aware of those. We don't have to dive into them, but I know that Reggie would speak his mind. Sometimes probably wasn't the best option.
And he said it when I just want people to know that Tennessee had the first openly gay player in SEC football history or college football history in Jackie Walker, who is a 2-time All-American and died of AIDS in, I believe, 2001 was when he died of AIDS. And it was around that time Reggie White was saying that stuff. And did bother me, but he did reportedly start to moderate his views much more. And before he came public with that, died. So it's unfair for me to judge him for comments he made, when he was just learning something or just getting involved in religion in a certain way, and not judge the whole person or not look at who this person would have become overall. So I think that stands out. And I do know this. Whatever he may have said, I think his heart was in the right place. That's what I kind of gathered reading more about it. And honestly, here's the thing. Reggie White, and so it's unfair for me to hold this against Reggie White when he never was able to explain himself or to show if he had changed or anything like that. I will say he was one of the things that stands out to me about Reggie White is for a defensive tackle to be so rough. You talk about it all the time, Dave. Defensive tackles have to be mean-spirited. For Reggie White, it was like the opposite. It was like he was at peace on the defensive line, wasn't he? It was like he had a headspace. You see this with the fighters in UFC a lot of times where they say they feel peaceful when they're in the ring or when they're in the octagon fighting. Didn't Reggie White give off a vibe of he felt peaceful and at peace knocking players down in front of him, didn't he?
No, I think he was perfectly fine with that.